Hello, and welcome to the course on literary criticism and theory. In today's class, we'll be looking at psychoanalysis and psychoanalytical literary criticism. This is going to be a two-part lecture. In the first part of the lecture, we'll be looking at some psychoanalytical concepts and the names of important psychoanalytical theorists, including Sigmund Freud and his protege, Carl Gustav Jung. The second part of the lecture, we will follow it up with a bit of Lacanian psychoanalytical theory. The lecture will also be complemented by a psychoanalytical reading of some prominent literary texts. So, to begin with, what is psychoanalytical criticism? Now, put simply, it is a form of criticism which uses some of the techniques of methods known as psychoanalysis in the interpretation of literature. Psychoanalysis itself is a form of therapy which sought to aim or which sought to cure mental disorders by investigating the interaction between the conscious and the unconscious elements in one's mind. Now, the classic method by which this is achieved was to get the patient to talk freely in such a way that all his repressed feelings and emotions and desires and fears, etc., which are understood to be causing the conflicting problems, are forced to come into the patient's conscious mind and openly faced rather than remaining deeply buried within his own unconscious. Now, this process itself is based on specifically the practices of how the mind and the instincts and specifically and most importantly perhaps sexuality works. Now, these theories were developed by an Austrian psychologist known as Dr. Sigmund Freud. Now, these theories and methods were developed by Freud, who lived between 1856 and 1939. Now, there is a growing consensus among theoreticians and scholars today that all therapeutic values of the methods advocated by Dr. Freud might be somehow limited, and that Freud's own life work is perhaps seriously flawed by a lot of methodological irregularities. At the same time, we cannot deny the fact that Freud remains a major cultural force and has made massive contributions to the way we think about ourselves. Now, all of Freud's work depends upon the notion of the unconscious, which is, like I mentioned earlier, the part of the mind that goes beyond the conscious, which nevertheless has a very strong influence on our day-to-day actions. Now, many of Freud's own ideas concern aspects of sexuality, and it is perhaps one of the reasons why Freudian psychology is kind of often made in controversy. Notorious among his theory is perhaps the theory on infantile sexuality, which this is basically the notion that sexuality begins not at puberty or at physical sexual maturation, but even way before that, especially through infants, the male infant's relationship to his mother. And connected with this idea, of course, is the idea of the Oedipus complex. Oedipus complex is basically a theory by Sigmund Freud, which says that the male infant conceives the desire to eliminate the father and become the sexual partner of the mother. Many forms of intergenerational conflicts are seen perhaps by Freudians as having a bearing or having Oedipal overtones. For example, professional rivalries between a generation of men and perhaps the preceding generation of men can be explained using this framework. Now, there is a famous book called the Anxiety of Influence by Harold Bloom, which was published in 1973. And this book discusses the struggle for identity by each generation of poets, and sees this struggle between different generation of poets as an example of the Oedipus complex. Now, as you can imagine, the very idea of the Oedipus complex would suggest perhaps that Freudian theory is often deeply masculinist and biased, and that's also one of the reasons why Freudian classic theory, or Freudian theory in general, was often attacked by feminist critics and thinkers. And so another key Freudian idea is that of the libido, which can be understood as the energy drive associated with sexual desire. Now, in classic Freudian theory, it has three major stages of focus, including, of course, first the oral, the anal, and the phallic. Now, these are in turn derived from the five stages of development that Freud had originally proposed. The libido in the individual is part of a more generalized drive, which Freud would later call eros. Now, eros is derived from the Greek word for love, and which basically implies the life force, and it is complemented by what we call thanatos, which is derived from the Greek word for death, and basically implies the death instinct. Now, depression is also key Freudian terminology that you need to be familiar with when you understand psychoanalytical literary criticism. Depression implies the forgetting or the repression of, or the ignoring of unresolved conflicts, unadmitted desires, or traumatic past events, so that they are in a way forced out of our conscious awareness into the realm of the unconscious. This is the psychological defense mechanism, which is intended to guard the psyche, unnecessary trauma, of course. The underlying assumption in psychoanalysis is that when some deep-rooted wish, when our fear or a memory or a desire is too difficult to face, we might try to cope with it by representing it or eliminating it from our conscious into the unconscious. However, what needs to be acknowledged is that this does not necessarily make this unwanted feeling go away. It still remains alive within the unconscious and constantly sees a way back into the conscious mind, always succeeding eventually, of course, to come back into the conscious mind in one way or in one form or another. Now, another key Freudian mechanism is that of projection. This is a process when we usually use negative aspects of ourselves that we do not really recognize it as belonging to us. Thus, our own dark desires are in a way disowned and expelled from ourselves. For example, to give an example, a student who feels that everybody in his class is intent on copying on an exam would perhaps be exercising a form of projection himself. He is unable to admit that he has tendencies to copy during the exam, and this results in him projecting all these negative feelings to his friends and the people that surround him. So in fact, when he's being paranoid about his fellow students copying and cheating on an exam, a Freudian psychoanalyst would perhaps argue that this is because he has an innate tendency and a deep-rooted desire to cheat in this very exam. Now, later in his career, Freud would suggest the three-part model of the psyche, dividing it into the ego, the superego, and the ID. Now, this is the basic tree model of the psyche or the personality. Now, let's first start with the ID. The ID is a force that roughly corresponds to the unconscious, while the ego corresponds to the conscious, and the superego corresponds to the conscious itself. Now, the ID is a primitive life force, and it is governed by what you would call the pressure principle. The ID does not really care about, the consequences of actions. For example, if a person were to be completely consumed by the powers of the ID, if you were feeling hungry, you would perhaps look for the closest source of nutrition. If someone feels hungry, he would look for the closest source of nutrition without thinking about the consequences by which he would get that. He would not really care about whether this food is accessible to him or not, whether taking this food or consuming it would violate in some way some other codes that govern established norms of behavior. Now, for example, he would not think twice before considering whether this food is something that is not accessible to him, because he does not have the money to pay for it. He would just be interested in insinuating his own feelings. That is why it is related to the unconscious. The ego, on the other hand, is governed by what we know as the reality principle. So, for example, even if a person is feeling extremely hungry, he might be forced to look at alternative circumstances too. For example, he might think about whether he has the money to buy this or not, or whether he is in a position to safely steal the food or not. The superego, on the other hand, corresponds to the conscious, which again is derived from all of your moral codes and your spirituality and your religion and law and order and things like that. For example, a person who is completely driven by a superego would rather choose to starve himself to death rather than steal a piece of food. You can see how these three levels often overlap, as you can see from what we have just explained. Now, a final example of important in Freudian terminology is perhaps that of dream work, of the dream work, which is to say the process by which real events or desires are transformed into concrete dream images. Now, this can include processes such as displacement, whereby one person or any event is represented by another in some form of or through some form of a symbolic substitution. It is also complemented by a process known as condensation, whereby a number of people, of events or meanings are combined and represented by a single image in the dream. And of course, we'll come back to this or to these terms in greater details when we discuss in the second lecture Jacques Lacan. Thus, we understand that characters and motivations or events are represented in dreams in a very literary sort of a way, involving it is a translation by the dream work of abstract ideas or feelings into concrete images. For example, an abstract idea like fear or love can find a concrete expression in a very literary way in a person's dream, and this is why literary studies is interested in psychoanalytical models of criticism. Dreams then, just like literature, do not make explicit statements. They both tend to communicate obliquely or indirectly, avoiding direct or open statements, representing meanings through concrete embodiments of time, space, or action. Now, Freudian interpretation is popularly thought to be a matter of attributing sexual connotations to objects, so that everyday objects like towers or ladders, for instance, are seen as a phallic symbol. Now, you can see immediately how this might be slightly problematic, and one of the reasons why psychoanalytical Freudian and psychoanalytical criticism is open to great environment criticism from many different other theories. For instance, the metaphor of a snake would perhaps be a very strong phallic or have a strong phallic connotation for somebody who is interested in Freud. But you can see clearly how, for instance, a Victorian woman who sees the image of a snake might have completely different connotations from that of, say, an Algerian or an Indian woman, a very religious Indian woman, for example, who is perhaps used to the idea of worshipping a snake as a religious deity. Now, Freudian interpretation is often highly ingenious rather than highly simplistic, as we shall see soon in the case of some Freudian examples. Now, Freud believed that a dream was an escape hatch or a safety valve through which all of our depressed fears and desires or memories seek an outlet into the conscious mind. The emotion in question would be a censor by the conscious mind, and thus has to enter the dream in a disguise, so to speak. Now, like I said earlier, condensation is one of the processes by which this is achieved. Condensation refers to the dream's tendency to combine several themes into one dream symbol. For example, in dreams, multiple dream thoughts are often combined and mixed into a single element of the manifest dream. To give you an example, even if you keep your work life and your personal life strictly separate, you might not be surprised to find that characters from your workplace often melded and mixed into characters from your own personal life in a dream. Thus, people and places often seen melding and mixing into composite figures in dreams. This is exactly what the process known as condensation implies. To give you another example, imagine the case of a young woman or a young man who lives under the authoritarian thumb of his powerful and dominant father. Now, imagine also that he is in love with a young French girl. They have an alliance which his father would be vehemently and strongly oppose. Now, Sigmund Freud would not be too surprised if this young man had recurrent dreams of a young policewoman who does this, of a young policewoman who would come into his dream. Now, how does this happen? Here in the dream, both the father and the French policeman are associated with ideas of strictness and authority and power, and coupled with the fact that he is in love with the French girl that the father disapproves of. He has different recurrent images of a French policeman, which is basically his dream symbols that are condensed into one. Now, here both the feared father and the desired lover are condensed into a single dream figure of the French policewoman. Now, Freudian interpretation, thus, as you can see, has always been of considerable interest to literary critics. Now, the basic reason here, again, is that the unconscious, like the poem or the novel or the play, cannot speak directly or explicitly, but thus so they speak through images. They talk to us through symbols and emblems and metaphors. Now, likewise, literature too is not involved with making direct or explicit statements about life, but it is more concerned with showing and expressing experience through images, symbols, metaphors, and so on. Now, however, because statements made here are not explicit, there is an inevitable element of judgment that is involved, and consequently, psychoanalytical interpretations of literature are often controversial. Now, this can be very well illustrated by the example of the snake metaphor that we have discussed earlier. Now, a discussion of Freud and his psychoanalytical theories also warrants a brief note on archetypal criticism, which in this context significantly was developed by his protege, Freud's protege, Carl Gustav Jung, who worked together with Freud for many years before parting ways and developing radically different theories. Now, the theories of Carl Gustav Jung, which we know today as archetypal criticism, will be discussed in the next lecture, inshallah. Now, thank you for listening, and see you in the next lecture.